So I guess like first question is, can we kind of decode or break down back hip tension? Like, I guess Scott, first with you, what do you think of when you think back leg tension? How does that fit into this idea of hinge, removing slack? Like what exactly is going on there?
Yeah, I really like kind of all of those terms at different times, so to speak. Whether it's hinge or your best loaded position. Any of those kind of things are interchangeable to some degree to me. I think in my experience, like you mentioned, I am kind of in between, in terms of anatomical bias. So I've tried like several different methods to try to figure out the best kind of way for me. And ultimately it kind of struck me as I was watching like some of my best throws of all time, like just with no context, like whether that was pull downs or a pitch or whatever. And I was just watching and it kept striking me that like the position that I was finding was like a kind of an IR bias or, something that I wasn't expecting because I knew that I had, I guess, more external rotation and I had usually been trying to kind of sit out or, force vertical shin. And, for some reason that just like wasn't meshing in my brain. And so I started thinking about just like, if I want to produce maximum power, that way, I have to produce maximum tension or, rotational load into my hip. And so that's kind of, I started chasing that feeling, and ultimately that kind of brought me back more to the IR style, even though my hip anatomy might not like directly say that.
So big picture, like zooming out before we get into like the specifics of ER versus IR, back leg tension is simply loading the spring to be able to have something to unload.
That's how I think of it,
Right.
for sure.
Kind of the way I'll think of it, like you ever hear the term, you can't shoot a cannon out of a canoe. It's this idea of if you have any sort of instability in the system, in the ground contact point from the shoe, from the foot, from the ground, up through the entire back hip, that entire complex. If there's any instability there, you're not going to have anything stable to rotate your pelvis against. But if you can remove slack, which is really, in my mind, removing slack is the same thing as creating tension. It's literally just two sides of looking at that idea.
Yes.
But you think about it, if you have shoes with no traction, what do you have? You have an instability with the ground. If you have an ankle that's not stable, what do you have? You have an instability in that chain. Knee that's not stable, or maybe you banged up your knee, now there's an instability point. If you can't pull out that tension from the back hip, now there's an instability point at that joint. Mm-hmm. So I think of it as like at every single joint through this entire back hip complex down to the ground, you're creating tension, you're sinking that up to the pelvis. Now that you've loaded that, you have to be able to move down the mound while holding that tension, but now you have something to actually unload against, something stable. If this is just loosey-goosey out here, it's like there's nothing to rotate against, and that's when you see guys, upper half takes over, their arm starts to push, start to yank, pull off really hard, because there's nothing to actually unload from the lower half, because they haven't loaded into the lower half.
And I think that's just a common thing that I see with a lot of athletes. They're sending me videos of them doing a med ball throw or a drill, and the first thing I notice is their foot, slipping out on the turf or whatever it is. It's like, no matter what you're trying to do, like you said, first you have to have a stable base to push into the ground against or into the rubber against. If there's some sort of give there, that's an instant leak, automatic compensation kind of up the chain. So
I mean, that's why the first thing I say to anyone is like, all right, if you're just going to stand there and you're going to try and get your leg in the most powerful position, like how are you going to do it? You're not going to do it just by going like this. You're not going to do it just by going like this. Like it has to be a move back and turn to create that tension, power position. And if you can't do it just by sitting here and creating it on your own, how are you going to do it when you're moving full speed?
Three-dimensional.
Yes, three-dimensional move right there.
Yeah. And that's the idea we talked about before of a rotational hinge.
Yes.
Like a hinge, a deadlift hinge is just straight back, but there's not necessarily that internal rotational tension. When you teach that, do you actually feel like a coil or a stretch when you get to that position? What does that feel like for someone who doesn't even know where to start and they're like, I have no idea if I'm creating tension or not?
I think like what Matt just said about, three-dimensional load, like that is totally what I think of too. And to me, that means there has to be some combination of, up and down, one dimension, backward, forward, kind of weight shift, 2-dimension, rotational, 3-dimension. So when I hit all 3 of those, like that's my best position or kind of the best pattern that I'm shooting for. If I'm only up and down and rotational, like that's going to affect my delivery out there. So 3-dimensional, I think, is a really big key for a lot of guys.
And I think fundamentally there's 2 points there. One is that what exactly are you, when you say creating tension, like what is exactly happening? My thought is that you have basically a fixed point to the ground, stable foot position, and you're literally winding the fascia and you're winding the deep hip rotators. You get like this, if you exaggerate and you get into some of these positions, you can literally feel like a winding up inside the hip socket itself. So there's a fascial winding, there's a winding of the different deep hip rotator muscles. But then the second point there is that you mentioned like it's a 3-dimensional winding. The exact degree of hip flexion, the exact amount of knee bend, the exact amount of coil, that's going to be completely dependent on your range of motion, your hip anatomy. So that might be interesting to talk about too. It's one of the tests that I'll use is just like a seated hip IR test, and just based on that, you almost get some indication of like where their shin angle might be, because you'll have someone like Matt, like, so you can imagine just sitting on a box and doing this, but this is, my good hip. My other hip's not so great right now, but you can see I have, easily 45 degrees, a good amount of hip IR. We look at Matt, we look at my, or my bad hip, no IR there. We look at Scott, he's somewhere in between 15, 20 degrees. And so that's a great just rule of thumb, or like very quick.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah, it's a starting point to have some idea of like, okay, is this somebody with really good ER, really good IR? And that might roughly in a lot of cases mirror the ideal shin angle they're gonna have on the mound. So you think about someone who can easily get into that position, on the mound, they're gonna be able to get into a much more lateral loading position versus you, like you're fully wound, you demonstrated that, but you're still in more of a vertical shin. Yeah. But I think for me, the thing that clicked when we had this discussion, I think 2 months ago, is I've always known how to relate to guys that have a lot of hip IR that move like me. I can project what I'm feeling on them and have, reasonable certainty, but I never quite knew how to communicate with guys like you, where it's like I have completely different ends of the spectrum. Like,
Tough to coach something you've never done.
So for me, the question was like, for guys like you see that on video, like a Verlander, they're gonna have more of a vertical shin typically. They're gonna clear the lead leg a little bit earlier. That's obvious, but what are they feeling internally and how do they get to those positions? That's the important piece that I could never make the leap to until we discussed that, until Scott was like really experimenting with it and saw, hey, despite not having great IR, still trying to load into IR was his unlock. And then talking to you, like you still are coiling and creating tension.
Yep.
It's just you don't have much range to like coil into, so it still ends up looking like a vertical shin.
Yeah.
Well, there's a difference between that and like trying to hold the knees out this way on the outside of the foot.